What's up, folks, and welcome to another episode of the Pearl Snap Tactical Podcast, the show that gives you the tips and tools you need to make yourself stronger, faster, and harder to kill. Think about this for a second. What happens when the power goes out and it's not an accident? In recent years, attacks on the nation's critical infrastructure have really revealed just how fragile these modern systems are that we all rely on. When infrastructure fails, the evidence or the effects cascade fast. Hospital strain, medical devices stop working, fuel pumps go offline, the public safety degrades, and civilians often suffer the most, even when they don't really play a role in protecting these systems. So, in this episode, we're going to examine some real attacks that have happened here at home on the U.S. power grid, what actually happened on the ground, how some of the plots were detected and stopped, and some of them weren't, and what these incidences reveal about the risk we have to this country, as well as our preparedness, posture, and resilience, how we can build that. We're also going to explore like what you as a civilian can realistically do without getting paranoid or resorting to vigilantism or anything like that, but just how to recognize signs, how to respond, and how to reduce the second order effects when these systems fail. Before we do, quick shout out to my premium subscribers on Substack. I've got something new I'm rolling out for you guys. It's called the Team Room. This is something where it's basically a live stream for paid subscribers only. This is a way that you and I can interact together face to face, even if it's online, to where we'll talk tactics, training, mindset, just the regular topics we do here on the show. And I really wanted to do this because over the years, back when I was on the road running training events and everything, over the years, I've made so many friends that came to classes that I formed relationships with, people that I still keep in contact and visit with today, that are spread across the country. And I don't know, that's probably the biggest boon I've gotten doing this is just the relationships that I've made. And so if I can, I want to interact with everybody who supports me and who spends their time investing in this show to keep it going. So the Team Room's where it's going to be at. So be on the lookout for that. If you want to jump in on it, just go to our subscribe page, upgrade your free to a paid membership, and you'll get that and a lot more benefits. So without further ado, we are talking about what happens when let me try that again. Without further ado, we're talking about when the grid fails, lessons from real attacks here on the Homeland. It's all on the Pearl Snap Tactical Podcast, and we're starting right now. All right. Welcome back. I'm still your host, Mark. Still recorded live from an undisclosed location south of the Mason-Dixon line. This is Pearl Snap Tactical Podcast. All right, guys, in this episode, we're going to talk about critical infrastructure, but not in abstract policy terms, none of that boring stuff. We're going to talk about some real attacks that have happened here in the United States. And we're going to walk through several documented cases where everything like electrical substations that were deliberately targeted, what the attackers did, why they did it, and how the attacks unfolded, and most importantly, what happened afterwards. We're going to look at the damage that was caused, the human consequences, and in some cases, how law enforcement intervention prevented things from getting much, much worse. And most importantly, we're going to translate these into lessons in civilian terms for you. I know I got a lot of military guys and law enforcement here as part of the audience, but a lot of civilians too. And so I try to make it applicable to everybody, because even if you don't work in law enforcement or in the utilities or emergency management, we all depend on these systems every day. And if they fail, the burden doesn't fall evenly. The elderly, the sick, families with children, and the unprepared communities, they're going to feel it first and the hardest. So This really came out of I wasn't expecting to do this episode actually. Just a couple of weeks ago, at the date that I'm recording this, I did an online briefing class for law enforcement about law enforcement's role with with protecting the grid, and trying to better help them do their job with that. And it just got me thinking, because I was like, man, this stuff affects everybody. I know everybody's interested in it. Everyone's concerned about it. But as a civilian, you're just kind of left out of the loop because you don't really have an active role in the protection of the grid. So I was just trying to think about, is this something people would be interested in? So I put it up on the Substack notes. I put it out there and I said, hey, I just did this class. What do you guys think? Is this something you're interested in? And I got a lot of feedback on it. So clearly this is something that's top of mind of a lot of folks. And so that's why thought I would do this episode. So when it comes down to this, it's really just another metric of uncertainty, right? Attacks on the grid. So remember, preparedness is the remedy to uncertainty. So let's clear away the cobwebs and get some clarity on what you can actually do to mitigate the effects if an aspect of the grid goes down in your area. And so by the end of this episode, you're going to have a better understanding of just how fragile modern infrastructure really is, why small attacks have outsized effects, what warning signs often appear before an attack, what responsible, non-dramatic preparedness looks like, and how civilians can contribute to stability instead of becoming part of the problem when systems fail. That's a lot of stuff. I hope we can get through it all in the time we have allotted. But that's what the team room's for. We'll clean that stuff up in that session. So this is all about awareness and resilience and just maintaining order when systems we rely on are stressed or deliberately attacked. So let's get after it. So segment 1, why critical infrastructure matters. So before I get into specific attacks, I want to frame the issue. What is critical infrastructure? Well, it is the backbone of modern life. In 2006, the Department of Homeland Security established what was called the National Infrastructure Protection Plan, or NIPP. You can look it up. It's a risk. It's not an agency or anything. It's just a risk management framework designed to give structure to the federal government, state and local agencies, and private entities to manage risk collaboratively across all the critical infrastructure sectors. The plan identifies 16 sectors of critical infrastructure, also known as CIs, as the foundation framework for its risk management approach, focusing on system-level resilience, integration of cyber and physical security for safeguarding things like, I'm not going to list all 16, you can look it up, but you're going to get the gist of it. But it includes things like power stations, water treatment and sewage facilities, healthcare, heating, communication, fuel pipelines, transportation systems, just like everything from like on the road trucking to bridges, things like that, and much more. So just agricultural, all that kind of stuff, right? The things that are needed to keep a nation going, basically. So as you can imagine, many of these sectors are interconnected. So if one of the systems fail, the consequences cascade, and it kind of causes a domino effect, right? Where one can collapse onto the other and impact the others very quickly. So just for instance, imagine it's a really cold winter day and the power goes out for thousands of homes and buildings in the neighborhood, right? Hospitals, they got to run on backup generators. Traffic signals can stop working, gas pumps may fail, even short-term outages can ripple outward, creating medical emergencies, economic losses, and safety hazards. And when that happens, civilians are always affected, even if they don't play a role in protecting those systems. But you've got a vested interest in knowing how these things work and trying to prepare if something like that were to happen. And that's why understanding the vulnerabilities isn't just for professionals. I really think it's for everybody. So let's talk about how the infrastructure is attacked. And you might think that like sophisticated cyber attacks are the main threat, and that is a big ticket item for sure. But in a lot of cases, some of these attacks, especially the ones I'm going to talk about today, are really low tech and purely physical. Not real sophisticated, but the damage was pretty catastrophic. So, substations, for example, are often exposed with minimal security. Rifle fire, sabotage, cutting fences, or even explosives can disable critical equipment. So, reconnaissance, observation patterns for security, noting gaps in surveillance is often part of the planning process when it comes to how law enforcement, their role in trying to protect these sites. So now, when it comes to attacks, the motives vary. Like some attacks, I think, I don't know, even with me, a lot of times when I think about this stuff, my brain just always goes to terror attack or some state funded thing or actors or things like that. But sometimes the attacks are just purely criminal. They're opportunistic acts to create blackouts for like things like burglary. We're going to look at an example where that was done. Others might be ideological. And sometimes they're just entirely unknown. We don't know why they do these. So I've kind of got examples that will address all those. And I don't know, maybe some of these could just be driven by curiosity or mischief. That's always a possibility too. But the common thread in all these attacks that I'm going to share with you are just simple. They're just simple, low-tech, unsophisticated attacks. But the consequences were catastrophic. So let's look at a couple of these examples. So the first one I want to turn your attention to, and if you're following along on the post and Substack, I've got additional sites to articles and press releases from the DOJ. If you want to learn a little bit more about it, I'm just for the sake of time, I'm just going to give you the cliff notes on it. So let's talk about the Baltimore grid plot of 2020 to 2025. That span of time, the attack didn't last that long, but that's from the point of inception of the planning and the conspiracy to the arrest and prosecution. So that's what that time frame's for. So the first case involved an individual by the name of Brandon Clint Russell, the alleged founder of a Florida-based neo-Nazi group called the Atomwaffen Division, and Sarah Beth Clendaniel, if I'm saying that right, a Caddisville, Maryland resident with a few felony convictions. So Russell and Clendaniel conspired together. He provided the extremist ideology and the planning and guidance, according to reports, and she was positioned on the ground to help carry out the attack. So the conspiracy was active between 2022 and 2023. So according to the reports I saw, the two planned a coordinated attack on 5 electrical substations in the Baltimore, Maryland region, designed to cause a cascading failure of the power grid, which would have disrupted electricity, heat, hospitals, fuel, and communications across the metropolitan area. So also, according to reports, the defendant subscribed to a white supremacist-linked ideology and an extremist doctrine known as accelerationism. And accelerationism, if you've not heard about it, it's the belief. In this case, I don't think it's the belief for everyone that subscribes to it, but in this case, their version of acceleration was the belief that an orchestrated violent attack could hasten societal collapse and kind of reset things. So Russell saw infrastructure destruction as a way to, quote, completely destroy this whole city, unquote, and further his extremist goals. Now, Russell shared open source infrastructure maps with Clendaniel and a confidential informant that was working for the FBI, and they discussed methods to strike transformers with firearms to cause cascading outages. Clendaniel identified multiple substations around the city to hit on that day for maximum effect. If you will recall, last year I did an episode on the terrorist threat cycle. We talked about all of that, about marking targets, gathering intel, planning, tooling up, rehearsals, all that stuff. I think if you go back and listen to that, that'll help kind of fill in the gaps and kind of give more flesh to the details that I'm giving you here. But conversations included the belief that a few well-placed shots could knock out the critical grid functions. So law enforcement became aware of the plot through the confidential informant working for the FBI, of course. And so on February 3rd of 2023, agents executed a search warrant at Clendaniel's residence, seizing firearms and ammunition, despite the fact that she was a felon and wasn't supposed to have that stuff. Shocker. But the defendants were arrested before the plot was executed. So Clendaniel pleaded guilty to federal conspiracy charges and was sentenced to 18 years in prison plus supervised release. Russell was found guilty of conspiring to commit damage to an energy facility, and in August 2025, he was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison with a lifetime of supervision. Prosecutors estimated that the planned attack could have caused up to $75 million in damage and widespread service disruption if executed. So you think about that. Really, just a couple people with some rifles could cause $75 million of damage. So what are we learning here? And I think this case for me demonstrates that violent infrastructure attacks can be ideologically motivated, right, for sure, and planned well in advance. That's a pretty low-hanging fruit thing. Federal investigations and informants can help intercept plots before execution, preventing large-scale disruption. I know the feds get a bad rap a lot on certain issues that are going on with the country right now, but there are a lot of good or great men and women that are working on keeping us safe, and so I just wanted to call our attention out to that because they do get a lot of bad press for other stuff. And so but the other thing is these style of attacks don't require high levels of sophistication. You don't have to be trained in a terrorist camp in some third world shithole country and then fly over here, in a cloak and dagger way to carry out these attacks that can be catastrophic. I mean, you don't need that. Really, even a low IQ person, unfortunately, can do this. A very low bar to entry. And so, targeted attacks on power grids are viewed by extremists as an effective way to destabilize communities. And if you go back and look at the episode I did on Terrorism 101 and then the terrorist threat cycle, it really kind of puts into all that of how terrorists, when they're ideologically motivated, why they choose the certain targets that they do, how they select them. And so anyway, that would be a good companion episode if you haven't listened to that already. Or go back and listen to it again. Come on. Let's go to case number 2. And that is the Moore County, North Carolina substation shooting, also which occurred in 2022. So in this case, we focus on a group of unknown attackers, which, as of recent reporting, no arrests have yet to be made, and the motive remains unconfirmed. So the attack occurred on December 3rd of 2022 in Moore County, North Carolina, against 2 electrical substations owned by Duke Energy. And by the way, 85% of the infrastructure is owned by private entities, by the way, just for you, if you're ever playing tactical Trivial Pursuit. All right, these were deliberately shot by these unknown assailants with rifles. So in this case, they actually did carry out the attack. It wasn't just a conspiracy. So they damaged transformers and other components. And the attack occurred in the evening when substations were minimally staffed. So, like I said earlier, the motive has not been publicly established, but law enforcement officials described the incident as, quote, intentional, willful, and malicious, unquote. Glad we got that knocked out. For what we can tell, the assailants used rifles to open fire on the transformer banks and critical switchgear. Ballistic casings were found at the scene. They were recovered on the site and run and for analysis, but no vehicles or suspects were publicly identified at the time of the report. So what were the results? Nearly 35,000, and I saw some reports that said 45,000, but I just went with the lower number, but that's still a lot. Nearly 35,000 at least residents were without power for several days. Hospitals had to switch to backup generators. Heat and water systems were disrupted. This was December. And at least one death was linked to the outage. We're not saying that that person died because of that, but someone could make the argument that because of the outage and the problems the hospital experienced, right, the medical emergency that person had was exacerbated by the power loss. And county officials declared a state of emergency They opposed curfews as the community struggled with the prolonged outage effects. So law enforcement communicated with Duke Energy and federal partners. Like I said, ballistics were run to identify possible connections. Rewards were offered to the public for information leading to arrests. But at the time of this recording, no arrests have been forthcoming. So what do we learn from that one? So physical attacks on the grid infrastructure can have immediate severe impacts on the civilian populace. Extended outages risk medical emergencies for loss of life, not just inconvenience. I know everybody has had their power go down for a while. I've certainly lived through a blackout before, but it's typically just a pain in the butt. But, when you think about the elderly, when you think, especially during certain times of the year, or medical people who are getting medical services and stuff, it could be really dangerous. So the lack of arrests highlights the challenge in solving crimes where perpetrators leave little evidence and evade capture. So that's a tough one. That one is still yet to be solved. All right, let's go on to a third one. I think this one might be our last one, just to kind of give you just a sampling of these things. Here's another one. This is I didn't mean to do this when I was doing my research for it, but all these ended up being substation attacks. But there's plenty of them, and I'll let you research those on your own. But of other sectors that have been attacked in the past. But this is the Washington State substation attack, also in 2022. So on Christmas Day, December 25th, 2022, a coordinated series of deliberate attacks on electrical substations in Pierce County, Washington, left thousands of people without power due to a major holiday and winter weather. These were not isolated attacks of vandalism. They caused up to $3 million in damage and triggered a multi-agency law enforcement response that led to federal criminal charges. So who was involved in this? So according to a press release that I've linked to in the show notes, or on the Substack page, the suspects were two men from Puyallup. I don't even know this town. Puyallup, Washington. For you Washingtonites out there, I'm sorry if I'm butchering the name of your town. But the folks that were involved were Matthew Greenwood, age 32, and Jeremy Crayon, age 40. Both were ultimately charged in U.S. District Court with conspiracy to damage energy facilities and possession of unregistered firearms after a fast-moving federal investigation. So here's what happened. Early on Christmas Day, multiple electrical substations, not just one, multiple, in and around the Tacoma area were breached and sabotaged. So 4 substations were targeted, 2 operated by Tacoma Power, and 2 by Puget Sound Energy. The attackers gained access past perimeter fencing, right? They basically cut the fence, manipulated equipment, and disabled key systems, causing the power outages. So basically, they broke in and just vandalized the place to shut it down. One substation was reportedly set on fire after equipment, due to some of the equipment being tampered with. In the criminal complaint, investigators noted that the suspect used bolt cutters to break into the facilities and manipulated switches or breaker controls to shut down service, causing arcing and sparking in at least one case, which led to the fire, no doubt. So the initial impact was that the attack caused power outages for approximately 14 to 15,000 customers in the Tacoma area, and some which lasted much of the holiday. Utility crews worked quickly to restore services, and by December 26, most people had power restored, but not everybody. So the loss of electricity meant interruptions to the water systems, so for homes with electric well pumps, and general disruption for holiday activities for family. And one resident noticed that homes lost both power and water during the outages. So according to the criminal complaint and later reporting after the arrest, the motive, and this is the one that's I think is very interesting, and one that may not really be on your, I hate to say this phrase, your bingo card, but it's apropos, right? The motive appears not to have been ideological in nature. It wasn't terrorism. It was just criminal opportunism. And you're like, what? What are they doing? Let me explain. So Greenwood later made statements to investigators that the blackout was intended really just to facilitate a burglary of local businesses, while they wanted to basically shut down all the alarms and power systems, shut those down and then go burglarize places, businesses and whatnot, and to just be able to do so with impunity. So there's been no publicly documented linkage between the suspects and any extremist group or broader ideological network, despite initial concerns by officials about the possible coordinated sabotage. So a team of federal agents with the state and local law enforcement acted quickly. Using cell phone data and location tracking, they were able to match Greenwood's and Crayen's phones with the proximity to all 4 attack sites at the relevant times. And then surveillance footage from one of the substations identified one of the suspects and a distinctive pickup truck that linked it to the defendants. So this led to them obtaining a search warrant for the suspect's home, which recovered clothing that matched the surveillance images. So what this case shows us is that, motivations for infrastructure attacks aren't always terrorist in nature. I mean, they could just be purely opportunistic and criminal, not always ideological. And simple physical access and manipulation of equipment can cause significant disruption. Again, very low barrier to entry, man. All you need is some bolt cutters in some cases, and just the will to Wreck-It Ralph all over the place. So it's not you don't have to pass a high IQ test to be effective on these. Law enforcement techniques, right? So including cell phone analysis, surveillance footage, rapid interagency response were crucial to identifying, locating, and arresting the perpetrators before additional and ongoing damage occurred. So, the NIPP that I had alluded to that sets that framework, it really kind of lays out the framework for how your state, local, agencies with the feds and even these private entities, if the utilities are run through private entities, how they work together. Everybody has a role to play, and the NIPP kind of lays that out. And so this is top of mind for law enforcement. They do train on this. They do get briefings, just like the one I gave a couple weeks ago, on this kind of things. And this is something that law enforcement is very sensitive to. So the case highlights the vulnerability of a decentralized infrastructure assets, and the need for vigilant security practices and community reporting. So how's all this fit together? So each of these cases highlights a different way the grid can be threatened. You can have an ideologically driven extremist plot, hopefully thwarted before execution, as it was in this case, but not always. A criminally motivated blackout attempt, right, that led to arrests, or just some mysterious physical attack with prolonged outages and civilian suffering, the reasons as to which we're still uncertain of, right? And we haven't even talked about the threat of cyber attacks, the potential for state-sponsor attacks, or other domestic terror threats. I'll leave you to research all that on your own, but it's there if you want to go looking. But the takeaway is this. Like I've said before, the attacks don't have to be technical. They don't have to be high-tech to be effective. The consequences are felt by ordinary people just like you and me, and law enforcement intervention and intelligence sharing really does matter. It makes a difference, and it certainly did in some of these cases. So they all demonstrate why civilians should understand how infrastructure attacks unfold, not to overreact, but just to recognize the stakes and the signs without recognize the signs and the stakes that are there, without necessarily going out and confronting it, right? You've got other things you can do, and that's what we're going to talk about here in a second. So the lessons learned, like I've already said, various motives, criminal, ideological, opportunistic, or unknown. The attacks are simple but highly disruptive. Early reporting and detection can save lives and reduce damage. And that really is law enforcement's role that's laid out in the NIPP, is the detection and prevention. And then also in case, then also critical incidents handling. And if that is the case, if the attack actually goes through, and then, coordinating between these law enforcement and utilities is very critical. So let's talk about with the civilians, right? Let's talk about your world. Let's translate this for you. So what can you do realistically? Let's be honest here. What can you really do about this stuff? As a civilian, you don't have a badge. You're not tasked with the job of patrolling or pulling security for these facilities. And let's be honest, it's highly unlikely you're going to catch an attacker preparing for an attack on a site that you drive by past on your way to work. But that being said, it goes without saying that if you do notice suspicious activity near a substation, transformer, or any other sector of critical infrastructure, you need to report it and not confront anyone. This is not a time for heroics. This is just simply report what you see, and I promise you law enforcement will have a response to that. Report concerns to your local authorities. It's a hot topic for them. They are very sensitive and very aware about these attacks. Prepare, but that's just kind of the boilerplate stuff, right? We all know that if you see something, say something. All right, that goes without saying. But let's talk about other things that you can do proactively. So preparing for short-term outages, right? I think at the minimum, 24 to 72 hours of water, food, medicine. If it's wintertime, making sure you have the capacity to heat your family, keep your family warm through alternative means if the electricity is out, and have some means to communicate with the outside world, right? That is something that we all talk about it all the time, and few people do it. So get prepared. It's not a heavy lift to have, 24, 48, 72 hours worth of things on hand to make sure that your family can ride it through. Yes, there are cases that outages can go longer than that. I mean, this wasn't an attack on the grid, but years ago, and where I live, we don't get a lot of snow. I mean, we'll get some, but we don't get a lot of it. But we get a ton of ice storms. And we had an ice storm hit so bad that huge trees just snapped in half. They tore down power lines. It looked like something. It was so surreal. I mean, there were trees over streets. All the weight of the ice had bowed the trees down. In one respect, it looked very pretty, but the town was desolate. There were streets, parts of the city you couldn't even get to. They had to bring in crew upon crew from out of state to restore power, to clear the roads, and it took months to do that. We were out of power. I think we were out of power for like maybe a week and a half or so, but there were some places out in the county where they were out for I think over a month. I mean, it was crazy. But if you have like that 24 to 72 hours, somewhere in that window, yeah, if you're going to go for, you could go without power and resources for longer than that. But if you have that window, that gives you some breathing room to where you can figure out your next step. And that's really a lot of times really what is critical, right? It's just being able to have time to plan and know what your next steps are and not to be caught flat-footed. So that's the point of that. You can reduce secondary risks during outages by avoiding unnecessary travel. And again, if you have a little bit of preparation in mind beforehand, then you won't have the need to go out and try to buy the milk, butter, and bread when everybody else is rushing to Walmart and Sam's and Costco and everything and emptying the shelves. Make sure your home is secure and you've got a way to follow official updates. And then stay calm and help your neighbors, help your communities. And again, that starts now. That starts with building relationships with your neighbors and the people you live next to, so that if an attack occurs, or even if it's not an attack, if it just through natural disaster, something goes down, this preparedness is where you'll shine. That's where you're going to make your money in this type of situation, because you provide strength, you provide resilience, and assistance to your neighbors, and that alone will do more to reduce chaos and mitigate the negative impacts of a disaster more than anything else. Right. So let's wrap it up. Like I said, even if you're not a utility worker or a law enforcement officer, you live downstream of infrastructure failure. So awareness, observation, preparedness, that makes the difference between a manageable disruption and a disaster. So by understanding the who, what, when, why of past attacks, we can become more informed. We can become more resilient and proactive. We can get ready for this. And so small actions by everyday people makes a difference. So stay alert, report threats if you see them, and above all, be preparing now for these outages. Take care of yourself and others in the critical role, and you will play a great service to your community. And with that, that is the end of this transmission. I hope you enjoyed it. Share it with a buddy. If you would, go ahead and give us a 5-star on whatever platform you're listening to, and leave a comment or a review. That really helps us spread the word. If you've got any topics in mind, hit me up and let me know what you want to talk about. So without further ado, I'm going to say I'm Mark. I'm signing off, telling you to stay sharp and keep it Pearl Snap.